So we're continuing this look at the Catholic theological landscape following Tracy Rowland's book, Catholic Theology. Again, to give credit, the majority of the material here comes from her book. We looked at Thomism, which really led us into the 20th century, and we're going to look at two approaches now, starting with this Communio approach and then next Concilium. And the importance of this distinction or divide, or these two schools of thought, is quite large to the 20th century and into the 21st century. In her book, Tracy Rowland, quoting another writer, Philip Trower, she describes this intellectual battle between these two schools as a theological Star Wars played out over the heads of the faithful. In other words, what people in parishes received as, quote, the teaching of the council, that is the Second Vatican Council, was often the residue of ideas floated by the former Vatican II experts in one or the other of these journals. So these words, Communio and Concilium, refer to theological journals that were founded in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Actually, the latter of the two is Communio. And I'm asking you to watch a video by Bishop Barron that talks about the split between these two. So we'll start with Communio, and we'll start by looking at some of the differences between these two schools. So Communio in contrast to Concilium, what sets the two apart? We're going to use the language of Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, and it seems that the Concilium school would have understood the Second Vatican Council according to hermeneutic of rupture. Now, hermeneutics it's the study of interpretation. So this is a question of how do we interpret what happened at the Second Vatican Council. The Concilium scholars see it as a rupture, that we interpret the Second Vatican Council as a break from what came before, a radical break. Which means we don't have to necessarily read the council in light of previous councils or previous teachings, that there was a real rupture and something truly new arose with the Second Vatican Council. Well, on the other hand, the Communio scholars, which we'll address more directly in this video, understood Vatican II according to a hermeneutic of continuity or reform, that Vatican II, that council, stands in a larger tradition of councils and has to be read in light of them. Another way to look at the difference between these two is that Concilium authors tended to discuss church teaching with reference to the spirit of the times. What's going on today? We'll see this played out more and more as we go forward in these two videos. Communio writers tended to reflect on theological matters with reference to the whole intellectual tradition, from patristic times, that is the early church fathers, to the present, with a disposition of respect to the received teaching while recognizing the potential for ossification. Ossification is when something becomes stone or bone and becomes brittle and old. So the idea isn't simply we're stuck in the tradition, but we look back on the entirety of the tradition. As we're again, those Concilium authors really want to focus on the spirit of the times here and now in order to interpret these matters. So this gets us actually to this question of a different interpretation of the signs of the times. And this was a phrase used several times by the Second Vatican Council in the importance of discerning the signs of the times. And the question is, what does that mean? Well, the typical Communio scholar reads the Second Vatican Council as emphasizing the importance of Christocentrism, the centrality of Christ. That is, Christ is the sign of the times. When we talk about reading things according to the sign of the times, it's Christ. And therefore, this Communio school focused on the renewal of theological anthropology, that is the human person, and Trinitarian theology. So looking at the human person in light of the Trinity and our destiny to be in communion with the Trinity. So on the one hand, here we have the signs of the times are Christ himself. The Concilium scholars, however, read Vatican II as an exhortation to be aware of the signs of the times in the world and enter into dialogue with the world on the world's terms. And now we're going to start to see the differences here. Is our tradition judged in light of the world, or is the world understood in light of our tradition? Communio scholars say give priority to that tradition, to Christology, to Trinitarian theology, and the Concilium scholars say give priority to the interpretive key that is the world on the world's terms. We're going to get into Communio here. So this is the Communio scholars. This is, again, people like Joseph Ratzinger, Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar. These Communio scholars are set apart by the question, where did secularism come from? Now, both schools are going to address secularism, but they're going to address it in different ways and have a different evaluation of it. For Communio scholars, where did secularism come from? Now, what is secularism, right? Secularism is the idea that the world has its own autonomy from God and can be thought of, conceived of, and run just fine without God, right? We have a growing secular world. Well, where did that come from? First of all, Communio scholars are going to say that's a bad thing, right? We can't legitimately understand the world apart from God because the world comes from God, is directed towards God. Okay, so the question, where did that come from, this idea of secularism? Well, they're going to have three big villains. So one of the fault lines here is, where do you lay the blame for secularism if you lay blame anywhere? Communio scholars tend to agree that modern secularism can be traced to the rejection of what's called the analogy of being, and it's replaced by Scotus's unificacy of being. Okay, so it's tracing it back to the late medieval theologian John Duns Scotus, and here's the idea. The analogy of being in Thomas Aquinas was the idea that we speak of being, of different things in different ways. That there's more than one kind of way of being. So it's kind of like when I say I love my dog, I love pizza, I love my wife, I love God. Those words are related in some way by proportion, but I don't mean the same thing every time. This is the analogy of being when we say that an atom exists, and Adam and Eve exist, and God exists. There's some proportion there, but we don't mean exactly the same thing. And in fact, we looked at with existential Thomism, it's really grounded on God is the sheer act of being, and we participate in his being in various ways. So what this means is God is not some supreme being. He's not a being at all. He's the very ground of being in which we all participate. Now, if that's the case, then you can't separate out some sort of secular realm from God, because that secular realm only exists because it participates in God's being. There's a sense in which God is more intimate to all of creation than it is to itself. Well, the idea is Scotus replaced this with a unificacy of being, right? So unificacy, we're speaking the same way about everything. So you've just got this ladder of things that are all on the same ladder. So you have acorns and algae and antelope and apes and Adam and eventually angels and God. And they just happen to be all in the same category. Some are just higher than others. So no longer, back to the slide here, no longer do we have being, our being, as participation in the being. That's removed, right? And the natural then can be studied independent of any reference to the supernatural. So we start to see this, again, division of the natural and supernatural. God is just one being among many, and we can have our being independent of God. Well, we'll push forward here with these ideas. I know they get a little complicated. The other is this question of nature and grace, which we looked at last time, and we're back to Suarez. Henri de Lubac, in his book Surnaturel, powerfully critiques the radical separation of grace and nature in that Baroque scholasticism of Suarez. Remember, Suarez, it said, gave us this idea that nature is just fine on its own, the natural human person, and grace is added from the outside as kind of like the icing on the cake. And Henri de Lubac challenges 500 years or 400 years plus of settled theology and saying, no, that neither the fathers of the church nor Aquinas ever conceived of the human person having a purely natural end or natural happiness attainable by the powers of intellect and will. That is, he said, there's no such thing as pure nature, natura pura. So again, we're tracing, where did secularism come from? These Communio scholars following de Lubac said, well, look to Suarez. He separated out grace and nature in this radical way. The idea is if one makes the natural a self-enclosed, self-reliant system, the supernatural, well, it becomes superfluous. We don't need it. And hence contributing to the rise of modern secularism. And then our third villain here, we have Scotus, and then Suarez, and Immanuel Kant, whose name we've brought up before, as where we saw some transcendental Thomists like Rahner are going to embrace Kant. For the Communio scholars, no, Kant is another villain. There's a rejection of Kant's notion of religion within the limits of reason alone. Kant wanted to sever the intrinsic link between faith and reason. Can we really separate those out? And Communio scholars tend to draw faith and reason together into a symbiotic or intrinsic relationship. There's no sharp dichotomy between theology and philosophy. And we saw that happening in the Baroque scholasticism, in Leonine Thomism, in the strict observance Thomism, this separation out of philosophy and theology. And these Communio scholars say, no, we can't do that. We can't even construct what's called the preambula fidei, the beginnings. We can't even construct the philosophical beginnings of our faith by means of merely rational arguments independent of any supernatural light. It's all infused with grace and with faith. So one of our main names here that we've already referred to is Henri de Lubac. For de Lubac, what is theology? To do theology is to demonstrate the explanatory power of the truths of faith with regard to the constantly changing context of the world. Again, notice what takes priority. It's the truths of the faith. We interpret the modern world, for better or for ill, in light of the truths of our faith. To understand man, the human person, and the world precisely in the light of those truths. To see all things in the light of Christ. It's very poetic. It's very symbolic understanding of things. So he favored a symbolic and patristic thought. That is the thought of the early church fathers. He was opposed to theology as this overly dialectic or rationalistic system with its syllogisms. That's, formal logical argumentation or hair-splitting distinctions and logic arranged into systems to be memorized. So he's one who's reacting to those manualist, neo-scholastic teachings and saying there must be another way to do theology rather than this overly rationalistic approach. So what shapes him, he's wounded from a shot to the head, and he reads the entire, it's called the Patrologia Graeca et Latina, all of the early church fathers in the original languages. This takes up feet and feet and feet on a bookshelf. So when he comes to his seminary studies, he's reading St. Thomas. He's reading Thomist sources with a comprehensive understanding of patristic antecedents. So he's not reading St. Thomas with these Baroque commentaries in mind. He's reading St. Thomas with this wealth of understanding of the church fathers. When you read Henri de Lubac, he's basically an encyclopedia of the early church fathers. So he sees paradox in theology not as problematic. In fact, it's internal to the incarnation itself, right? Paradox. How do we hold up two seemingly contrary things in tension? And he says, well, gosh, that's at the heart of our theology. Look at Christ. Fully God and fully man. That's a paradox in and of itself. We should expect paradox everywhere. So these opposing aspects will be raised to signify the full depths of the mystery of truth. Is the church human or divine? Yes. Is the scripture written by God or humans? Yes. Is God in utter control through his providence, or are we free? Yes. So these paradoxes, de Lubac doesn't want to explain them away by hair-splitting distinctions in logic. No, he wants to hold all of these truths together in a symbolic language of theology and in the category of paradox. So his concern is synthesis, to reunite what should never have been torn apart by finer and finer distinctions of scholastic conceptual clarifications. So it's this theology that involves paradox and symbol and poetry rather than being reduced to logic and hair-splitting distinctions. Another major name that you'll hear is Hans Urs von Balthasar, which was very influential to Pope John Paul II, among others. He reacted against what he found, again, like these others, to be the stale scholasticism of his seminary education, and he also turned to the work of the Church Fathers. There are stories out there about von Balthasar going to his lectures in seminary with earplugs in and sitting in the back and reading the Church Fathers instead. So a few important points about him. He sees mystical experience as what's called a locus theologicus, that is a source for theology. He's influenced by the mystical experiences of a friend of his by the name of Adrienne von Speyr. He wrote books about her mystical experiences and worked her mystical experiences into his own theology. So here's a key point for us. Balthasar insisted on an intimate connection between one's spiritual and intellectual life. You can't separate out spirituality, prayer, your intimate communion with God from some sort of separated out academic theology. So there's an immensely Christocentric and Trinitarian methodology. It all comes back to Christ and to the persons of the Trinity. That's at the foundation for von Balthasar. And he talks about he uses a nuptial structure of revelation. How does God reveal himself nuptial in the language or the methodology of falling in love and marriage? So for him, theology has meaning. Theology has meaning only in faith. Theology has meaning only in faith because the existential attitude, right, the foundational attitude of the person in faith, that alone gives access to the intimacy of the relationship between bride and bridegroom. That is us and Christ, which is the place, the locus of revelation and theology. Again, it's this wedding of spirituality, communion with God, and theology. You can't do theology for von Balthasar outside of that attitude of faith, because it's faith that unites you to the bridegroom Christ. And this comes out in his 15-volume trilogy, this massive work of von Balthasar, in which, and here's a key for him, gives priority to beauty over truth. So in this look at true, good, and beautiful, a lot of times the progress is from true to good to beautiful, doctrines to morality to then aesthetics, the beauty of the faith. And von Balthasar, in this kind of nuptial structure, wants to say, no, that's not how a person falls in love. He goes through his trilogies in 3 parts in 15 volumes. Starts with the glory of the Lord, theological aesthetics, beauty. Revelation is the appearance of the divine glory or transcendental beauty. It only then moves to what he calls the theodrama, the relationship between God and the human person from the perspective of transcendental goodness. So we move from beauty to goodness, and then finally to what he calls theologic, that is the relationship between Christology and ontology, or being, from the perspective of transcendental truth. Now, if that didn't make sense, we can boil it down this way. For von Balthasar, one must first perceive Christian revelation as beautiful through the contemplative gaze. Then one would be prompted to assent to follow Christ in a dramatic life of discipleship. And finally, only from within, once inside that life of obedience to Christ, would one come to see how and why Christianity are true. So he somewhat reverses the classical approach, perhaps. And notice the structure here. How does one fall in love? One is attracted to a person's beauty often, interior and exterior. They start interacting with that person in a common life, right? There's a truth into goodness, and slowly learn I should say beauty into goodness, and then slowly grow to know the truth of that person as well. And so he structures his theology around that. Another point of importance for the Communio scholars as literature as a locus theologicus, that is, literature and the arts in general become a source for theology. The idea here is that the interest there's an interest in the interrelationship of all the activities of the soul. As opposed to a dry rationalism, now we bring in imagination, memory, will, and intellect drawn together by the heart. And this gives rise to another trait of the Communio approach to theology. That is the interest in mythopoesis. And I had to look up mythopoesis. It's a narrative genre in literature and film where a fictional mythology is created. So think C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. Think J.R.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. This formation in literature of a mythical fictional mythology. Well, what's the point here? By looking at this as an area for theology, it's that theological ideas are often more persuasively expressed in poetry and literary works than in systematic theology. Why? Because of their appeal to the human imagination. So it's broadening out beyond the merely rationalistic or intellectual and saying, no, the human person also learns deep theological truths through these modes of beauty and symbolic language. So not just rational theology, but a symbolic theology. And finally, there's going to be in this Communio school, and again, very important here, distinction, a priority of theoria over praxis, or Romano Guardini will also call this the priority of logos over ethos. Theoria, logos, truth, praxis or ethos, action. So that is pastoral theology. Our actions out there in the world for the Communio scholars must be predicated on the entire intellectual tradition and treasury of the church. And pastoral theology can't be treated as a kind of master discipline that takes epistemic priority or the priority in the order of knowledge over scripture and tradition. Our practice is based on scripture and tradition, not the other way around. We don't read scripture and tradition in light of what we assume to be proper pastoral theology or practice. And that's going to bring us in the next video to the Concilium alternative, which is going to have different starting points and different priorities. So we'll save that for the next video.